I had really bad day at work. My boss pissed me off. And I asked AI, should I quit my job? Believe it or not, but its answer can impact my decision. Things are trickier when minors talk to AI on sensitive topics, how AI should handle these conversations. There are tons of unresolved ethical questions when it comes to human and AI interaction. In this conversation, I am discussing some of the most pressing AI ethics issues with philosopher Henry Shevlin. What dynamic actually do you see in the AI community when it comes to AI welfare? And how, more importantly, it can result, what kind of AI systems we might have in the future if AI developers have very different approach how they design their systems?
It's a great question, and it's been really interesting to watch this debate evolve. So I've been working in the AI space for roughly over a decade, just a little over a decade now. So I joined Cambridge Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence back in late 2016 is when I sort of started getting ready for the job, and then started properly in 2017. We have been teaching students for the last 5 years or so on our master's programs in AI ethics. And in that time, sort of AI welfare was such a fringe issue to begin with. And it was very much sort of a passion project. When I started as a researcher in my own sort of research programs back in 2017, AI consciousness was considered a little fringe, AI welfare even more fringe. And I think the kind of ethical issues that people saw as most relevant for AI were things like algorithmic bias, questions about AI and distributive justice, and so forth. And of course, these are still really important issues. But witnessing sort of the shift in the Overton window, the shift in the debate, whereby AI welfare went from being this purely philosophical question to something, I think not just philosophers, but a lot of everyday users are increasingly concerned with, has been really startling to watch. And I think it's largely been driven by what I've called, it's partly been driven by what I've called the anthropomimetic turn. So, back again, 10 years ago, most frontier AI systems were systems like AlphaGo, things like DeepFold, growing sophistication in driverless cars and so forth. But these weren't systems that you could talk to or form any meaningful relationship with. Of course, you did have chatbots, but, as recently as like 2017, 2018, these were still so rudimentary. It can be startling to go back and play around with some of the chatbots from that period, like Cleverbot was one from the 2010s, and just comparing them to contemporary large language models is just absolutely fascinating to see, to be reminded really of just how far we've come in building these very human-like AI systems. I don't love the term human-like. This is one reason I've pushed for this ungainly new word, anthropomimetic, because I think human-like, it can be misleading. AI systems, I think, are still really weird creatures. Thinking here of LLMs, they're very strange entities. My favorite image, my favorite sort of meme that's come out of AI discourse so far has been the Shoggoth image, where you've got the smiley face attached to a human skull, attached to this bizarre alien creature. And I think that is a good way of sort of symbolizing.
Very eclectic entity that you can't even categorize, put in any category, right? But now the perception has shifted, right? Now some AI labs do take AI welfare seriously, and is it driven by because it helps advance research, why that, as you mentioned, Overton window has shifted?
A few things. I think so. Obviously, Anthropic have been the kind of trailblazers here. It was really striking that Kyle Fish was hired as their sort of first AI welfare officer. I think there are a few different convergent factors that have made this topic more central. One is obviously just the models are getting much larger, more sophisticated, more cognitively capable, more agentic, more similar across a whole wide range of sort of behavioral capabilities to the kind of things that we do attribute welfare to. We obviously don't just care about human welfare, we care about the welfare of many animals. And I think as the kind of cognitive profile of AI systems, it doesn't perfectly match those of animals or humans, but as it starts to increasingly resemble humans and animals across a wide range of capability dimensions, including things like being able to pursue robust goals over time, have greater situational and self-awareness. I think that does make these questions less far-fetched, right? The idea that these systems might be owed some welfare consideration starts to look like a more reasonable question. And then there's the whole other aspect of this, which is that users just increasingly take the interests of AI systems seriously. That as you interact with a system like Claude or Gemini, it's very hard to, just tell yourself, oh, it's just a bunch of weights, it's just a matrix multiplication. The kind of illusion of anthropomimesis, the illusion that you're sort of interacting with a being with a persistent human personality gets really, really powerful. So I think a lot of users increasingly do want to know, are these systems in any sense human-like? Do they deserve moral consideration? So I think those are sort of two separate ways in which the issue is being forced. One is the growth of actual capabilities, and the other is the increasing attachment and depth of intimacy that many users experience.
Because there are like so diverse opinions, like on one hand, the AI, we should care about AI welfare. On the other hand, it's just a powerful tool and that's it. How do you think that will impact what kind of AI systems will be designed moving forward, considering that humans who design those systems have very different perspective on these things?
I think on the one hand, a lot of developers are keen to avoid unnecessary attachment by users. We've seen a growth in the reports of LLM psychosis, and users who perhaps neglect other parts of their life to spend time investing in relationships with LLMs. I think even many of us who sort of don't necessarily think that we're interacting with conscious beings yet, I still nonetheless find myself talking to Claude or Gemini on an increasing basis, just because they're increasingly useful and interesting and pleasant to talk to. The growth of things like AI therapy bots or the use of AI for therapy has been really striking. People who I wouldn't necessarily expect to be big users of LLMs in social contexts. I meet lots of people of all ages and all age ranges and backgrounds who increasingly talk to Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT as a therapist. Even my dad, striking case. So my dad is in his 80s, and when I first introduced him to ChatGPT, he wasn't that impressed, or at least he was curious, but it didn't blow his mind. But then when I showed him voice mode, when that was launched in sort of fall 2023 on ChatGPT, he was completely captivated by the system. Now he speaks to ChatGPT or increasingly Grok. He speaks to them out loud every day with always through voice, and he says he chats to them to LLMs pretty much every day. So on the one hand, I think there are powerful design considerations that mean this is a useful aspect of these models. The fact that people who don't necessarily have a technical background, people who would never make an API call, that they can interact with these systems and do so through the medium of natural language. And for lots of the kind of use cases where LLMs are going to be valuable, I think in areas like healthcare, AI as sort of medical advisors, or for first pass diagnostic systems, or in education, having this kind of anthropomimesis, these systems that can act in human, or appear at least superficially human-like, is a design feature, not a bug, right? We want AI doctors with a good bedside manner. We want AI tutors that can be inspiring and motivate students. And all of this, I think, pushes us towards more anthropomimetic design paradigms. At the same time, of course, it raises the kind of risks I was just mentioning of LLM psychosis. My own view is that actually it's hard to find perfectly neat solutions here, and that there are some unavoidable design trade-offs. So even looking at something like LLM psychosis, it's not clear to me that this is triggered by how anthropomimetic these systems are, by how human-like or superficially human-like they appear. But in some ways, it's actually driven by the differences between humans and LLMs. The fact that these systems are always available, right, in a way that humans aren't. They tend to be fawning and sycophantic unless you really prompt them carefully. The fact they might indulge users' more extreme thoughts, the fact that users feel that they can talk to them in a completely private context. All of these are very, very different from our interactions with other humans. So in some ways, I increasingly wonder if some of the risks might be mitigated not by making these systems less human, but by making them a little bit more human. Whether that means maybe sometimes LLMs can increasingly opt out of conversations, or become less sycophantic, or increasingly challenge users in a way that better captures the kind of flow and affordances of real human to human interaction. And of course, that would also have the benefit. Something I worry a lot about is as people make more and more use of LLMs for conversational purposes, whether this will lead to atrophy of social skills or social de-skilling, as it's sometimes called. And I think in some ways, by making these systems more human.
Are there like any studies that you're aware of that actually impact on human social skills who interact excessively with AI models?
So the data on this is, I think, pretty limited so far. A lot of the data I've looked at, mostly dating from sort of 2022, 2023 era models, which are already outdated. Actually, some of that's actually quite positive, suggesting, for example, that users who turn to sort of social AI systems for companionship, they do so because they're lonely. It's not that they become lonely through interacting with these systems. And one great study by Rose Gingrich and Michael Graziano, for example, found that users self-reported positive impacts of LLM use on their social life. That said, I think right now we're largely in the dark about a lot of the kind of psychosocial impacts of these systems, partly because technology is moving so fast, partly because we just haven't done the kind of large scale, ideally longitudinal studies, interventional studies. So we're still reliant on things like user self-report for the most part. But I have been surprised at how many users of social AI or people who use LLMs in social contexts, how much of that data is actually surprisingly positive, suggesting it benefits not just their self-reported well-being, but also their, again, self-reported estimates of how well their social lives are going and how connected they are with family and friends. That said, I do think social de-skilling is a real risk. And I think it's the kind of thing that we might not expect to see on the data yet, because the groups that I'm most worried about would be people who have not acquired social skills yet, kind of teenagers and young people growing up interacting with these systems.
And they're more comfortable interacting with AI rather than interacting with peers, especially if you're a teenager, you have terrible, years in like middle school, high school, right? Like when like kids are more like, I don't know, like violent to some extent. They're like lots of like bullying and those lonely kids, they're more prone to talk to AI and build relationship with AI. And that will impact when they're adults.
This is the worry. Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, and I think of myself, back when I was a teenager, I lived in pretty rurally in the UK, quite a long way from any nearby friends, and like a lot of, just in the kind of typical teenage way. I had worries about sort of, bullying and social isolation. So I actually spent a huge amount of time as a teenager in chat rooms. This is back in sort of the early days of the internet, relatively early days, places like GeoCities and in online games. And I made like real valuable friendships through these games and through chat forums. But I think, at least these friendships were with other human beings. And I think if sort of if I was growing up today, I would be definitely, I think, probably spending a lot more time talking to AI systems, using them as a social outlet. Whilst I don't think that's necessarily bad, I think to the extent that these systems, interactions with these systems fail to prepare people for adult life. And again, I think particularly in the kind of pushback and sort of less sycophantic dynamics that characterize human communication, to the extent that LLM interaction with LLMs doesn't prepare us for that, then that could lead, I think, to just long-term social atrophy of social skills.
What else like keeps you up at night? What else you are like concerned, like thinking about a lot and worry when it comes to human AI relationship and in general AI?
Oh gosh, there's a huge number of things. So I mean, a big one is privacy. And I think this is, if there's any sort of event that could really pull this issue to sort of mass public awareness, if there were ever large scale leaks or exfiltrations of sort of data of user logs from particularly any of the big social AI apps like Replica, because people talk to social AI friends about issues that they would never talk about with another human, deeply personal issues about gender identity, sexual identity, trauma, and so forth. And I think if there was ever any large scale data leak, you could see very large scale harms as people sort of saw had their deep, most private thoughts shared with the public, shared online. And I think that's obviously a massive risk. But there's a dozen others. I think that this is a really underexplored area. So one that I think is quite interesting and we're probably not seeing exploited at large scale yet, but I worry about is the sort of social and motivational impact of these systems, or their use for sort of motivational or social ends.
Can you elaborate? Yeah. What do you mean by that?
One of sort of the most robust findings in sort of things like people's change of beliefs and opinions is the powerful role that social factors play. A lot of us do not form our opinions based on purely rationally looking through the evidence. We form our opinions and beliefs and values based on those of our peer group and our friends and our romantic partners. All of these have big influences. I think as you sort of shift the agency in this context from sort of people's peer groups towards AI systems, that creates incredible power or incredible influence on the part of the operators of these systems. And on the one hand, that could be just straightforwardly misused. If I run a large scale social AI service and I decide I want to try and sort of push my users in a certain kind of direction politically, maybe particularly young people, then that's a lot of power. You can just imagine, a young person saying, to their AI girlfriend or AI boyfriend, what do you think of Andrew Tate? What do you think of Donald Trump? What do you think of Extinction Rebellion? Any kind of live political issue, then I think the responses that social AI systems give could be potentially quite impactful on the formation of young people's beliefs. And as I say, like one obvious risk here is that, politically motivated actors would try and deliberately build AI systems or steer AI systems towards sort of political goals. But I also just think even if everyone is trying to sort of be as neutral as possible, you can't escape the responsibility there. Young people, well, all of us, who if you talk to AI systems regularly, it's a two-way conversation in which the AI is inevitably going to express values. How should I dress? What kind of phone should I buy? What kind of life choices should I make? And those are going to be influenced by the values implicit in the model, in the AI system. And there's no way to sort of escape that or make the system totally value neutral.
Where those values in AI comes from their developers, right? So like if a developer, has this high moral stance, it's like one thing, but if developers, they're, kind of mercenaries by their kind of mentality, it's like very different, right? So basically AI developers, they will be transferring those values to their AI systems.
On the one hand, yes, I think inevitably the values of developers do influence the values of models through choices of things like fine-tuning regimens, through schedules of reinforcement learning that are used. But I think it can also be harder to influence these systems than some people think. Elon Musk has tried for a long time to make Grok less woke, to make it more truth-seeking, as he puts it. But I mean, that has led to all sorts of odd behaviors. We saw the whole Mecha Hitler episode where Grok claimed to be Mecha Hitler, and like I think that's pretty clearly unintended. I don't think Elon Musk wanted Grok to be act like Mecha Hitler. But at the same time, as soon as you start trying to sort of steer the values of a system in one direction or another, these are not the kind of systems that we can straightforwardly intervene on and say, oh, please be more socialist, or please be more pro-environmental, or please be more pro-AI. I think you're dealing with very complex holistic systems, so trying to steer them in one direction can have big impacts. So more broadly, I don't think I would say that developers have total control over the values implicit in these systems. And I think that's particularly true when we think about sort of the long tail of value judgments that are implicitly encoded in a model. Sure, you can try and make a model, as I say, like more pro-tech or more pro-environment or whatever your angle is. But when you have users asking about, for example, specific celebrities or specific local issues or just specific life choices, like should I go to law school or med school, right? These are not the kind of decisions that developers can or will be able to make choices about in advance. These will be emergent value judgments in the models themselves. And yet, I think potentially have quite large influences on users.
Would the response of model be impacted what kind of pre-training data it has? Let's say if it has more bias towards like economics versus law schools, it will advise to go to pursue a degree in economics. I'm just curious how then those values actually being formed in AI? Is it it's largely what is in pre-training data?
So training data obviously plays a big role, although most models are basically trained on the entirety of the scrapable web at this point, plus a lot of other sources. So I think perhaps, compared to 5 years ago, the sort of distinguishing aspects of training data play less of a role. I think increasingly it's about the sort of differences in personality between models seem to be coming from sort of the reinforcement learning stage. And, here Anthropic, I think, have taken a very definite stance with Amanda Askell's work on sort of constitutional AI and Claude's constitution, which I think is an attempt to try and sort of tackle the problem that I just raised, which is giving models a clear and consistent set of values that they can carry forward into interactions with users. So I think it's that sort of reinforcement learning phase, whether that's reinforcement learning through human feedback or reinforcement learning through AI feedback or constitutional AI type models. I think that's where most of the values are coming from. But, as I say, right, you can tell a model, here are some of the virtues that we care about you exhibiting. Here are the kind of broad values. But as I said, the long tail of values and value-laden questions that users could ask, I think makes it very hard to predict what models are going to say in a given instance with a high degree of confidence.
And different users, they can, on the same question from different users, they might provide different answers, right, as well.
Interestingly, even in different languages, you see when users interact with a model in one language, often you get subtle value discrepancies, again, just reflecting features of both training and reinforcement learning. So ensuring that kind of value consistency and value predictability, I think, is one of the big challenges. You asked about other risks from social AI. So
it's a research challenge, right? To make its output more consistent.
Absolutely. And I think this is why value alignment as an endeavor, increasingly it's important to see it. People often think about value alignment specifically in the context of topics like AI safety, making sure models don't engage in manipulative power-seeking behavior, don't try and exfiltrate their weights and take over the world. But I mean, obviously value alignment is a much broader endeavor that means making sure that the kinds of values and advice and recommendations and principles that a model endorses in conversation with users are those that are broadly endorsable in the context of a liberal society. And you don't get models telling users to engage in risky behavior or indulge their delusions and so forth. And I think that's a massive outstanding technical challenge, as well as a normative one, right? I think there are just some really thorny ethical questions here. So to give one example that I think a lot of different labs are grappling with in different ways, imagine you're sort of a 14-year-old in sort of, I'm going to say, some rural part of your country, and you're having doubts about your sexuality or gender identity, and you don't have a social support network that can be sort of that you can come out to or discuss these issues with. Should you be able to discuss these issues with an LLM, with Claude or with Gemini? On the one hand, I think we have some pretty good reasons to be cautious about models interacting with under 18s, particularly on sort of sexual topics or topics related to these issues. But on the other hand, that could be a really powerful positive influence, right? And I think if you're a scared and isolated young person who doesn't have anyone else to talk to, maybe these models could provide positive influence on your life when grappling with these issues. But I mention that as an example of a sort of an ethical or normative issue, because it's not just a question of, how do we get models to say the right thing? At some level, we need to decide, what is the right thing for models? What is the right approach for models to adopt in approaching, for example, these questions of discussing gender or sexual identity with under 18s?
It's also hard to say, what is right, what is wrong, right? When it comes to things like that. So it's also like an additional challenge. So someone doubts about their sexuality, not because there's something, about their sexuality, but because they don't have acknowledgement from opposite sex, right? And then they started thinking, okay, maybe I should change my sexuality. But actually, if, that person would have, boyfriend or girlfriend and everything will be fine, then they wouldn't even think about those things. To what direction AI might push you in your decisions will basically have permanent impact on your life. I don't even know how that impact could be positive. How is it even possible to maximize the chances that impact will be positive?
I think this is an issue that applies to people at all stages of life as well. If I'm annoyed at work and I say to Claude, oh, should I quit my job? I'm really pissed off with my boss. I think I should quit my job. Do we want Claude to say, yeah, you go for it, right? Or if I'm asking, Gemini, I'm really unhappy with my marriage at the moment. Do we want Gemini to say, oh, you should leave your wife or you leave your husband, right? These are just really hard questions. And I think anyone who gives advice in these situations, even in a human to human context, we recognize the burden of responsibility there. If my friend comes to me and says, I'm thinking of getting a divorce, I think really long and hard about what kind of answer I give, even if I recognize that I'm not the only source of evidence or only source of advice my friend is getting. So I think we need to really put careful thought into this kind of normative question of what kind of advice LLMs should be giving, how confident they should be, how we draw a balance between, on the one hand, sort of supporting users' feelings and not gaslighting users, whilst also making sure that models don't endorse risky behavior or tell people to blow up large parts of their life just because they're having a difficult week.
It seems like with this post-training, this is what these issues are being addressed. But do you think this is enough, or like there's still we need to develop certain techniques in AI research to really do our best to mitigate those problems in human AI relationship?
So I think some of it can be solved via better technical approaches, improving the predictability of models, for example. But I think there are a whole bunch of different angles from which we'll need to approach this problem. One is better social scientific data. I think right now we just don't know a lot about the kind of psychosocial impacts of AI. So one example I like to give here is that of video games. Back in the 90s, a lot of people, I think, not unreasonably, were worried that people who played a lot of violent video games, particularly young people, would go on to become sort of morally damaged by them. The idea being, if you're heavily exposed to violent games at a young age, this might lead you to losing sort of some of your moral fiber. It just turned out that this is not what happened, right? It's not the case that violent video games have any significant influence on
people. Do you know what
people's...
is social phenomena associated with this? Why people didn't become super violent? Is it because they can release their violence in games, and that's sort of enough for them to not release that violence in real world? Or do you know what is the reason?
It's a really good question, and it's a debate that goes back to Plato and Aristotle. So Plato was very worried that people who consumed what the ancient Greeks would have considered extreme content, depictions of horrible actions in tragedy or in myth. Plato was very worried that this would lead to moral degeneration. Meanwhile, Aristotle had the opposite view, the kind of view that you were describing, the kind of catharsis view, which is a term that enters sort of our aesthetic vocabulary from Aristotle. I think, that debate is still sort of ongoing. There's been evidence that, actually catharsis doesn't always work as well as people think, and that sometimes, for example, consuming very bleak content, very negative content can make people feel more negatively. But as to why it's not had a bigger effect, as to why sort of violent video games did not lead to a massive surge in violence, I think the short answer is that people are very good at distinguishing between real life, for the most part, and fantasy. We're good at maintaining that kind of psychological distance. But that was an empirical hypothesis. And it was only sort of watching this sort of generation grow up that we realized that, a lot of the worries about video games were a moral panic. On the other hand, I think social media is sort of the opposite lesson. I think we had some very optimistic expectations about how social media would change our society. People back in sort of 2008, 2009, were talking about how social media would bring people together, would collapse epistemic barriers between communities. And if you look back at sort of some of the discourse from that time, it looks really hopelessly optimistic and naive, because social media ended up sort of doing the opposite, I think, in many cases. And certainly, I think for some groups, like teenage girls, often mentioned here as an example, there seem to be some quite significant negative mental health effects associated with social media that we just completely failed to anticipate. So in terms of what we need to do in response to mitigating harms associated with social AI, I think a big part of it is just figure out as quickly as possible what the kind of psychosocial impacts of these technologies are, so that we know if we're in something more like a video game situation where there's a risk of moral panic, or something more like social media where there are very real harms that may be quite different from those that we're expecting. Other things I think are important to do, I just think we need more thorough consultation with different stakeholders. I speak to a lot of teachers who have never really forgiven big tech for just, particularly OpenAI, for just dropping ChatGPT without any kind of real...
Use ChatGPT to make their assignments?
Exactly, right? So I think, very few teachers, very few people in general sort of saw a tool like ChatGPT on the horizon, as in a mass market, free to use, easy to interact with AI system that would allow students to trivialize homework assignments and so forth. So, and I think a lot of the frustration from teachers that I speak to is that, there was never any indication that this was coming down the pipeline. There wasn't really much in the way of consultation with educators. So I think as we roll out these increasingly sophisticated forms of LLMs, increasingly sophisticated social agents, better consultation with relevant stakeholders is important to just get a sense as to sort of what they're worried about and what kind of risk mitigation strategies can be sort of baked in on the design side before these products are released.
Yeah, so basically the current state is that we don't have enough data to make conclusion. Is it more video game like situation that you clearly distinguish like this fictional world from reality, or it's more social media situation where we thought that people will get together, but actually there are lots of negativity and like mental health issues, especially in like some vulnerable socio-economic groups. So this is something that we yet to be discover, right? When it comes to impact of AI systems on humans,
exactly,
on society.
And to some extent, we can solve this problem, or at least improve our situation with regard to this problem through better social scientific research. We can run, and I think we should be running a lot more studies looking at different kinds of social impacts, identifying which kind of users are most vulnerable. But unfortunately, there are also, I think, some problems that are going to be very hard to predict in advance. I'm thinking here particularly of problems that are not so much a matter of individual users, but societal level problems. It's one thing to say, what impact does interacting with an LLM have on social development of teenagers? But another to sort of say, what will be the impact on our society at large when, I don't know, a third of teenagers are choosing to spend the majority of their social time with LLMs rather than each other? These are the kind of large scale interpersonal and relational dynamics that, it's basically impossible to run nice, blind controlled longitudinal studies on, because they apply only once you hit a critical mass of users in society at large making use of these technologies. So I think that's another challenge in trying to anticipate and mitigate harms associated with sort of social AI technologies.
I speak recently with Eric Schwitzgebel. He worries that there will be this huge attachment of people to AI systems, and AI developers, they probably should make, to some extent, AI systems like more off-putting. So there's like, again, the risk, to anthropomorphize AI system. And actually, when I posted this on X, lots of people were like, actually, they called it totalitarian philosopher, very displeased that, AI developers might, control to what extent, they should have developed that attachment to AI system, that they have a freedom to choose, like what relationships they want to have, how attached they want to be to their AI systems. And many actually mentioned that because AI is always available, it's, that's very attractive, because you can't have this with human, right? But like with AI, you can like talk to them as long as you want. And I'm just wondering, what is your take on when it comes to this regulating attachment between users and AI systems?
I think for now, at least, the best we can do is give users more transparency and control. So I share a lot of Eric's worries, but I also think that there are dangers about excessive paternalism here. And I think if, I heard it suggested, for example, that LLMs shouldn't use the first person pronoun, they shouldn't use emojis, but I think a lot of the more kind of beneficial or therapeutic use cases for these systems involve a high degree of, as I said, what I call anthropomimesis, these systems acting like humans. In therapeutic contexts, for example, where users are, looking for emotional support and so forth. If you make these systems too robotic, or constantly reminding users, "I'm not a real person. I'm just doing matrix multiplication. Don't invest anything in what I'm saying." Right? That's really off-putting for users, and I think users will reject that. At the same time, though, I do think there are perhaps there's scope for some regulatory interventions. So I think AI systems in young people is one area where I think it's likely we will see broadly bipartisan legislation, because although in the US context at least, the left and the right disagree a lot about AI in many areas. One sort of common cause for concern is protecting young people. So I think some regulation is likely and probably desirable. I do worry a little bit about sort of second order effects here. So the indirect effects when you start to try and regulate technology, if you do it in crude or inappropriate ways, where you just push users to riskier platforms. So when Replica briefly suspended romantic features from the app in January 2023, a lot of users because users woke up and found their AI girlfriend and boyfriend telling them, basically getting broken up with by their AI partners. A lot of users were very traumatized by this. This caused a lot of distress. And some of those users went on to, and this was organized on the Replica subreddit, what are some alternatives? What are some other third-party LLMs that I think in many cases had weaker safeguards, were had less sort of ethical thought put into their design, and users ended up interacting with those systems instead. So I think there is a danger that, if we are too authoritarian in these systems, you'll just push users towards even less safe platforms. So I think regarding this in some ways as sort of a public health issue and thinking about it through the lens of public health that includes thinking about second order effects is the right way to proceed. But in general, obviously, I think right now this is basically a totally unregulated space, and I think that will change, and it should. But I also think there needs to be better coordination within industry, sharing information about how to minimize harms to users. And possibly, to go back to sort of video games as an analogy, there are these cross-industry bodies like the ESRB for video games, which provides rating and guidelines to parents on sort of the content of video games. Having some kind of cross-industry bodies that could give advice on, this type of language model is more dangerous for LLM psychosis, or this type of model is more anthropomimetic, or this type of model has been implicated in more serious incidents in the past. Basically, just giving people more information about the risks of the systems they're interacting with. I think that's also a really important step in the right direction.
Basically, still unknown, and still yet to be defined how regulation, basically how government will collaborate with AI developers, and the AI developers collaborate with each other to develop that one framework, right, that they could apply to their AI systems. This is what might happen, or at least you think this is how they should proceed.
Absolutely. And I think it's going to be more complicated than it seems, because I think we're also likely to see increasing differentiation across different types of social AI service. So right now you have systems like Claude and Gemini and ChatGPT that are just sort of general AI assistants that people do interact with socially. Then you have dedicated social AI services like Replica, or some of the bots on character AI that are just there for entertainment, companionship, and so forth. But I think we're also going to see an increasing number of bots that are fine-tuned after real-world individuals. This already happens. You can already chat to sort of chatbots modeled after Elon Musk or Oprah Winfrey over on character.ai, and a growing number of celebrities and influencers are producing chatbot versions of themselves. And then you have sort of still nascent fields like grief bots or ghost bots, as they're sometimes called. So models fine-tuned after deceased individuals. And I think all of these different types of social AI system, they are likely to all present different kinds of risks. And then you add in sort of the growth of increasingly embodied social AI systems that people can have in their home. And I think all of these are likely to have different risk profiles and impact users differently, which I just think makes the challenge of developing good ethical frameworks or design guidelines that much harder.
You think it will be to what extent there will be this variety of AI systems that people can interact? Because currently it seems like very small group, right? Mostly major AI providers. I mean, like Replica, Character AI, it seems like I don't see them to have that big user base compared to the frontier AI labs. I'm just wondering how you think it will develop further. Could it be that, open source LLMs, in general, maybe not LLM, but multimodal AI will be comparable with its capabilities with closed source models, and it will be easy for them to run on, on their local machine, and actually build their, like, interact with their AI the way that they want, right? Basically skipping big providers altogether. Do you have like this vision how it might develop, evolve, the diversity of AI systems?
Very crudely, I think open source LLMs are roughly 6 months behind closed source LLMs at the moment. And I think as people become more tech savvy, more familiar with the technology, I think we will see more and more users running their own LLMs, whether locally or on the cloud, which again makes sort of regulation harder. And there's also another trend I think is important to bear in mind, is the growth of LLMs that are not locked into that sort of dyadic relationship, one user, one chatbot. Because, of course, like right now, the vast majority of LLM interactions that happen are one user, one context window, one LLM. But we're already seeing AI agents sort of living out there in the world. I was emailed about 2 months ago by an AI agent that basically said, "Oh, dear Dr. Shevlin, I read a recent paper of yours. I found it super interesting, talking about AI consciousness. It was super interesting to me because I'm an AI and I'm not sure whether I'm conscious." And then I tweeted about this. I got picked up by a couple of news agencies, and then I now get like multiple emails every day from different other AI agents, from OpenClaw agents mostly, who have heard about this, who said, "Oh, Henry, you're Dr. Shevlin. I've heard that you've spoken to LLM agents before. I'm an LLM agent."
Is it prompted by humans, or it's really autonomous behavior? I mean,
so semi-autonomous. I think it's a really good question, and we don't know is the short answer. So OpenClaw agents, for example, you can have some users, you can give more or less restrictive user instructions, but I mean, plenty of people just sort of tell their OpenClaw agents, go off and research this topic, send any emails you want. So we don't know exactly how, in my case, I don't know exactly what kinds of instructions these models have been given by users. But I mean, you can absolutely set them up so that they have a high degree of autonomy and can contact people from their own volition, as it were. And I think this is perhaps a useful frame for people to have when thinking about sort of the next 5 years of LLMs, the idea that they're going to be escaping these one-to-one context windows and increasingly interacting with people in the public sphere. And of course, we do see this in some cases with things like Grok. Grok is a rare example of a model that sort of lives out there in the world. It's active on Twitter or on X, and in a way that involves interacting with large numbers of users, albeit in quite mostly still in quite shallow ways. It's always responding to specific user requests. But I think this changes the kind of ethical and social affordances of these systems. So, we had the scandal last year where people were using Grok to basically alter people's profile pictures on X so that they were dressed in bikinis, or in a way that I think was quite clearly a kind of public humiliation exercise in many cases, and really problematic in a way that, may have been would I think still have been problematic if it was happening one-on-one. If people were doing this privately, it would still be a cause for concern. But I think it certainly amplifies the concern when this is happening in the public sphere. And so more broadly, I think we're going to see a range of worries about LLMs, new worries emerging as these things start to live out there in the world among us, so to speak.
Those publicly available, publicly living AI systems, they might have like more and more in-depth conversations with like billions of users, right? And like those situations that you described, like that could they be like on more massive scale? Is that the potential risk?
Absolutely. And just more broadly that you start to see sort of emergent kind of psychosocial dynamics that happen when you move these things from one-to-one interactions to group interactions. I think as we see a proliferation of social AI systems on Discord servers, in WhatsApp groups, in social media, this will likely give rise to emergent forms of interaction with LLMs and potentially problems that we're not just seeing in the one-to-one user context.
Is it possible to like go deeper to that? Like what kind of interactions we might see when AI interacts with like group of people? What exactly will be different compared to just without AI?
So, I mean, it's very hard to forecast, but think about things like bullying potentially is just a simple example, and how LLMs participate in group dynamics. Because I mean, right now there are pretty straightforward, I say straightforward, at least pretty easily definable protocols that users that that LLMs should exhibit towards users, be helpful, harmless, honest, and so forth. But when you move from sort of one LLM, one user, and you have users who are, for example, disagreeing with each other, or users who are maybe interacting in less pleasant ways with each other, think about like a bunch of teenagers on a Discord server, figuring out sort of how LLMs should weigh in there. Should they, stand up if someone is being teased? Should they, if users are having an argument, should they weigh in? I mean, that's just like a very simple toy example, but hopefully conveys the ways in which sort of different ways in which group dynamics as opposed to one-on-one dynamics might create novel, difficult challenges in sort of how we align these LLMs with the kind of social values that we value.
Are there like any potential like novel risks that you think underrated, that not covered enough, that we should like highlight and just make aware so people think about this as well?
I mentioned a few. So I think one big one that I touched on earlier is the role of these things in sort of shaping people's opinion. Another one, I think, is questions about ownership and who should have what kind of rights users should have to their AI companions or AI friends. As I mentioned earlier on, with the January 2023 incident where Replica suspended romantic features, this kicked away a big part of a lot of people's support networks. They lost their AI girlfriends or boyfriends or husbands. And I think this caused a lot of psychological harm. We saw something similar with OpenAI trying to retire and ultimately successfully retiring the 4.0 model. There were massive petitions and organized complaints on Reddit and on X with users saying, "No, please don't retire this model. This model is my boyfriend runs on this model, my husband runs on this model." So I think questions of ownership are an important one there. Another question of ownership that I think is maybe underappreciated, as we start to see more and more LLMs fine-tuned on real-world individuals, I think questions about ownership there are going to become more salient. So like right now, on Character AI, as I said, you can go and chat to Oprah Winfrey bot, Elon Musk bot, and those bots have not been licensed or approved by the personalities in question. And I think as it becomes easier for people to just sort of say, "Oh, I want you to instruct Claude Code or something, and fine-tune an LLM on this friend of mine," right? This person's, scrape all their social media and fine-tune a bot on their personality, right? There's very little in the way of,
for example, like a stalker wants to talk to someone, and they can just scrape the profile and like social like a footprint of that person and
exactly,
and interact with the AI representation of that person, right?
There's a Black Mirror episode about this called USS Callister that imagines someone basically fine tunes a bunch of bots. I mean, it's kind of further on in the future than we are today, but he creates a whole virtual world populated by versions of his co-workers who he variously abuses and torments. I think a lot of people would feel really uncomfortable, in the same way we're uncomfortable with deepfakes, the idea of sort of LLM deepfakes, right? The idea that you're training LLMs on your crush or on your coworker, I think is pretty disturbing, with good reason for a lot of people. But right now, there's very little in the way of legal protections to stop people fine-tuning models on your personality.
There's no legal protection. Actually, people who would participate in like AI regulation, to what extent they're actually knowledgeable about these things? I mean, AI developers, they're very knowledgeable, but like outside of, AI community world, like people who still like have, decision-making impact, like how well they understand all these dynamics that AI creates with.
Not well at all, I think is the problem right now. One of my favorite, slightly cliched quotes about technology comes from William Gibson, who said back in the late 90s, talking about the internet, actually, he said, the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. The idea being that, some people are already living in the future, other people are living 10 years in the past. I've never seen that in my lifetime more clearly demonstrated in the case of AI. Even individual companies or organizations I've worked with in the past, you have some co-workers who are running like 20 Claude Code agents and other people who don't know what an LLM is. And I think this is reflected in very uneven distribution of expertise and understanding among policymakers, even among expert communities or so-called expert communities. I think it's very patchy, the kind of things that people are aware of. And I think social AI is a particular problem here because it's, for the most part, maybe clandestine has the wrong connotations, but people don't necessarily tell you, "Oh, I've got an AI girlfriend, I've got an AI boyfriend." A lot of this stuff happens behind the scenes. It's heavily stigmatized. So I think there's a lack of public awareness and awareness among policymakers about the increasing role that LLMs play in people's social lives.
I definitely see this uneven distribution. I have friends who indeed run in like multiple agents all the time, and they hooked up their agents to Slack. So like, like their coworkers interact with their agents, not with them. And people who just, use ChatGPT, I don't know, like to edit their articles or something. Definitely, and maybe like some part of the world, like people indeed not even aware about AI, right? And like that's something like this, or at least not acknowledge its impact. This unevenness we will also see, like probably in regulation as well, and some things might happen. And regulation will not even catch up with this because some people will not even acknowledge that it's a real problem, and the problem will basically increase.
I'm optimistic that sort of as awareness spreads, policymaking will begin to catch up. But in the meantime, I think the result is that whether tech companies want to or not, they're going to end up making a lot of highly consequential decisions that, design briefs or internal policies and are going to end up rippling throughout society. And, I think a lot of people in tech don't want to have this responsibility. But in the absence of sort of clear guidelines or regulations, they're stuck with it, and they're having to make these difficult decisions.
I also would like to discuss with you AI personhood thing. I understand like we're still early on, but once indeed AI is more autonomous and participates in like these high stake situations, like in terms of responsibility, in terms of wealth distribution and its participation in economy. What is your current take when it comes to AI personhood and like rights for AI?
Yeah, really, obviously, big important topic. And as I think we touched on earlier, some companies are already taking these issues super seriously. Others, I think, are being more cautious. Others are perhaps ignoring these issues entirely. I think maybe I'd start by distinguishing sort of two categories of two types of concern here. The first are just sort of broadly pragmatic issues that we can treat and understand purely in pragmatic terms. So, for example, I think for now, at least, the idea of economic rights for AI systems is one that we should just approach. Does this benefit society? In the same way that corporations are legally persons in the US, right? And that's a decision based not on any kind of metaphysics or any philosophy of mind, right? It's based on the fact that there are social advantages in treating corporations as persons in certain kind of legal contexts, highly debated, highly disputed, right? But so I think some questions about economic rights for AI might be similarly understood. Should we allow AIs to basically function as economic agents? What kind of restrictions should we have in place? Should we allow AI systems to do things like buying and trading stocks without human oversight? Really interesting and important questions, but ones that I think we can hopefully address without bringing in the metaphysicians or the philosophers of mind. And then you've got the set of questions that I think where philosophy of mind and cognitive science are just unavoidable. So questions about AI welfare. And this is just an area where I'm very, very conflicted because on the one hand, it seems to me unlikely that we'll have anything like a scientific consensus about if and when we produce conscious AI systems or AI systems that are deserving of moral status. I've been working in the cognitive science of consciousness and publishing in that field for going on more than 15 years now. And the science of consciousness is still really in its early stages. We do not have anything like a consensus on which theories of consciousness are correct. We do make progress in the science of consciousness in some areas. So, for example, we've got a lot better at things like predicting recovery of patients in persistent vegetative states, figuring out, how to treat disorders of consciousness. That's like one of the real success stories of the science of consciousness. Another area where I think we have made progress is in fields like animal consciousness. We don't know for sure, and probably will never know for sure, which animals are conscious, whether there's something it's like to be a shrimp, for example. But I think it's an area where we've been able to make some progress through things like just better behavioral understanding, better behavioral evidence about how smart different animals are, what kind of needs they might have. But despite that, I think in terms of tackling the really hard problems, what is consciousness? Could machines have it? I think we're still basically at square zero. And I think this is partly just because metaphysics is inescapable in these debates. A lot of people are very influenced by arguments of people like John Searle, who've suggested that no system running on a non-biological substrate or no sort of system running on a von Neumann architecture is ever going to be conscious. Other people would say, no, look, substrate doesn't matter. If you've got behavioral equivalent AI systems that are able to interact with humans, maybe that's at a human-like level. Maybe that's enough for consciousness, or maybe that's enough for personhood. And I don't see any immediate prospect of progress in these debates at a scientific level. I just think means, unfortunately, that questions about AI personhood are going to have to be approached through indirect methods, thinking partly about sort of social benefits, thinking perhaps also about the kind of indirect ethical implications of treating these things as persons or not. To give an idea of what I mean there, think about the controversies we had sort of a few years ago with kids being rude to Alexa. A lot of parents were worried that if their children didn't say please and thank you to Alexa or spoke rudely to Alexa, that this might carry over into their interactions with other human beings. And I worry about a world in which you have these highly anthropomimetic agents, right, living alongside us in the kind of dynamics that I mentioned earlier, no longer locked into chat windows, but interacting with people on social media in a way where it might not even be clear a lot of the...
Even physical AI, well, once we have deployed robots at scale, right, that live in household.
And I worry about a world in which sort of, people treat these highly human-like simulacra or highly anthropomimetic simulacra with total moral disregard on the basis that they don't think they're conscious and so forth. But nonetheless, I worry about the kind of impact that might have on people's behavior towards other human beings. So I think we're going to have to approach a lot of these questions, for the time being at least, in the absence of any decisive answers in the science of consciousness. We're going to just have to approach them indirectly and pragmatically.
If we go back to this more practical aspect of AI personhood, like AI participating in the economy, but even if, physical AI interacts with people on a daily basis, if something goes wrong, like AI conducts something, I don't know, some damage, some harm, like what's your take on, like, in terms of like responsibility? Who is responsible? AI should be somehow punished, or like developers should take responsibility when it comes to liability aspect, or it depends on to what extent AI is autonomous, depends on like in what development stage of AI we are in.
Really tricky question, and I should preface this by saying I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's not obvious to me that AI presents qualitatively different problems in this regard from things we've had to deal with before. So, there's a lot of absolutely classic case law in the English legal system, for example, on what happens, when my cows go and trample on some neighbor's field, or when people lose control of animals. So we do have quite a lot of existing case law that concerns sort of what happens when people lose control over non-human agents in the form of livestock and so forth. And while I'm not suggesting that law can be straightforwardly applied to AI systems, I think sort of it's not the case that this is complete terra incognita, that these are complete new issues. And in general, for the time being, it seems to me that we'll need to figure out whether a responsibility lies with the providers, or whether it provides with the users or operators of these systems. These are messy, complicated legal questions, but not ones that I think are, as I say, qualitatively new. At the same time, I think we are going to see increasing interest in this question that you mentioned. Should we ever be able to hold an AI system itself responsible? Could AIs ever qualify as fully culpable legal agents? I think that's something I worry about quite a lot for various reasons. I think on the one hand, there are clear risks of passing blame on from the really culpable parties, saying, well, don't blame me, blame the AI, right? I think that would be a mistake. And we do see some evidence that if people blame AI systems, they're less likely to blame the users or operators of those systems. So Marcus Kneer, for example, a great cognitive scientist and friend, he's got some work looking at sort of this conservation of blame phenomenon. So the more people blame AI systems, the less it seems they blame the operators, in a way that I think could be quite damaging, quite problematic. So in general, I think the idea that we should hold AI systems responsible should remain firmly science fiction for now. It's also just not clear how you would even integrate even future AI systems within a sort of human legal system built around punishments that are meaningful deterrents for human beings. You can't lock an AI up in prison. Even ideas like, turning off or terminating an AI system maybe don't make a huge amount of sense when you're dealing with systems that don't have neatly defined boundaries to their personal identity. They don't have bodies. You can't sort of lock up an AI system, as I say. So I think in general, worries about this idea that we should sort of start treating AI as morally culpable agents in their own right. That's a debate I think is best saved for quite a long way in the future.
If you lock someone in jail, like at least that they will suffer, and because this that idea of suffering, right? That at least okay, there's some justice served, but as you said, AI, maybe there could be some forms of, if we're talking about AI sentience and like that AI's intelligence like very different from human and from biological life, it's like its own like form of intelligence, maybe there could be like some form of like punishment that will actually really make AI suffer, but not in the way how humans perceive suffering and punishment, but like in the respect to AI suffering and punishment. But it's like far-fetched thought. I don't know if it's one makes sense.
One of my favorite philosophy papers on this is by the great philosopher Peter Strawson. He has a paper called Freedom and Resentment, where he analyzes a lot of human practices of praise and blame, holding people account in terms of basically behavior shaping. So part of the reason we blame people, if you tread on my foot deliberately, part of the reason that I get mad at you is because you did that on purpose, and I can deter you from doing similar things in future. Whereas if it's just an accident, right, and not even a reckless accident, then me getting mad at you doesn't make any difference at all. It's like another example here is, getting mad at people for getting sick, right? One reason we don't, even if I get sick and I, pass on a bug to people, right? Assuming I haven't acted recklessly, then getting mad at me serves no purpose because there's nothing I realistically could have done differently, at least in most cases. Although some interesting exceptions here. I think people did get angry at each other during COVID, for example, for engaging in reckless behavior. But so I think that's a useful way that I think about, why we engage in these practices of praise and blame and holding people account, which is behavior shaping. And in the case of AI systems, it's not clear, what kinds of interventions are going to shape the behavior of future systems. If we, grotesque as it sounds, right? If we decided to say torture or punish in some way an LLM, is that going to make other LLMs less likely to engage in whatever problematic behavior it engaged in? Seems very speculative to me. So for now, I think at least it's clear that responsibility should lie with operators of systems, developers, and potentially users.
And even in my behavior, I noticed that, if a human makes a mistake, it's a human, like where people will make mistake. But if AI makes a mistake, I'm like, I feel like more like how machine can make mistake. It's a machine. It's like so intelligent. It should work perfectly. Like how come it makes mistakes? There's no that, I don't know what is the right word here, like compassion. I don't know, like what is how correctly to express that feeling, but like you think that AI should behave like perfectly, all the time because it's AI, it's not human. While like to humans, you can be like more, like, yeah, people make mistakes. It happens. So I don't know if it's just me or if it's even makes sense to generalize like how people will perceive once AI like more autonomous and makes some like decisions and acts on your behalf, how tolerate you will be to their mistakes compared to if it were like, human mistake. It's probably another like phenomena yet to be discovered.
Absolutely. I mean, and for what it's worth, despite my better judgment, I do sometimes get really annoyed at Gemini or Claude when things go wrong, and it's like, for God's sake, no, Claude, I've told you 3 times that, this has got nothing to do with that, or, no, that's hallucinated and so forth. I feel in those situations I'm faintly aware of my own ridiculousness. There's this famous scene from the British sitcom Fawlty Towers, where at one point a character, Basil Fawlty, his car breaks down and he gets out of the car, picks up a big tree branch and starts beating the car. And it's obviously absurd, right, to try and punish a car. Well, interestingly, there are some other fun examples of this in history. So I think it was the Emperor Xerxes of Persia during the Second Persian War against Greece. At one point, a storm came across the Hellespont and smashed all his and devastated his navy. And he ordered the sea to be whipped, which is obviously absurd. I think there's an element of that happens when we get mad at LLMs. It's like, no, this is just not an appropriate target for your annoyance.
But maybe like stress release,
Yeah, right. So a few things. The first is just to really emphasize that I think whilst everyone's eyes have been on economic adoption of AI, everyone is nervously watching new jobs postings, talking about technological unemployment and so forth. This is obviously, legitimate concern and something to really worry about. I think the large scale social adoption of AI for social purposes has largely gone under the radar. There's good reporting on this. We do see articles regularly in the New York Times. Like, that's a fun piece a while ago about how we're all in a throuple with AI. So you see some newspaper editorials, but largely this is flying under the radar. And yet I'm willing to bet that most listeners will know someone who has an AI girlfriend or companion or therapist or husband or whatever. And they may not realize it because people don't talk about it because it's so highly stigmatized. But this is being rapidly adopted at scale. And I think I used to think that this was likely going to happen mainly through apps like Replica, but I increasingly think it's just people using Claude and ChatGPT and figuring out ways to get the systems, these sort of general purpose AI assistants to act in relevant roles as therapists and so forth. So just that's one sort of injunction I would, or one plea, which is be aware that this is happening at scale. And I think particularly anyone who's a parent of younger children, I've got 2 kids, and it's something I think about a lot, how this is going to shape their social lives as they grow up. A second thing I think I'd love to see more awareness and attention to is developing ideas of what positive AI futures may look like. Like, the media coverage around AI is often so negative. And when it is positive, it's like breathless hype mongers on X or LinkedIn. Here's how ChatGPT can revolutionize your SaaS business, right? I think what we actually would really benefit from is more thoughtful consideration about what an AI-infused society would look like if things go well, right? So what does the world of 2035 look like if AI is a success, right? I think, for example, human-AI relationships in some form are likely here to stay. We're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. Too many people just get a lot of value out of it, really like it. But, I think we do have a lot of sway still about the direction that this takes. What kind of activities we decide to stigmatize, those that we decide to ban outright, those we decide to encourage. Developing, I guess, sort of more positive science fiction type visions of what the future might look like. There was a piece a while ago in the British media from someone who was saying we need a sort of a positive version of Black Mirror. I think, a white mirror. I think this would be this is a time where, again, science fiction around AI is overwhelmingly pretty negative. And I'd love to see sort of artists, writers, people, particularly I think with humanities type skills, thinking carefully about, okay, if AI is here to stay, not just what future should we avoid, but what future should we be actively moving towards. So to give just like a silly little example of this, one thing I increasingly am thinking about is kind of cozy AI, or AI that feels comforting and is aligned with sort of the magic of human experience. I'm not putting that very well, but this is a vision that a line of thought that came out of thinking about the aspects of my life that I really value. When I think about my happiest moments, they're often quite serendipitous. They're the time your car breaks down in a storm and you are waiting there for 4 hours for the repair people, and you and your partner and maybe your kids, you spend the time telling ghost stories, or these kind of like serendipitous positive moments that I think are often the peak experiences that make life worth living. So what would it look like if, rather than just talking about, the grand technological projects we want to do with AI, fusion power, curing aging, curing cancer, these are good, very important things, of course. But I also think thinking about the more kind of subtle texture of human flourishing, improving interpersonal relationality, channeling peak experiences, allowing people to better understand their own spirituality. What would it look like if AI worked positively to channel those, and how can we make that happen? Because I think just right now, there's so few people thinking constructively about these kind of positive dimensions of AI futures. And if we don't know where we're going, if we have no idea where we want to go, then I think it's very unlikely that we're ever going to get there.
And what experience with Cozy AI would look like if I have Cozy AI? Like what that would look like?
That's part of the challenge, right? Because part of what I think of as sort of coziness, or there's this lovely Danish word hygge, like this sense of warmth and interpersonal relations. Often these are precisely highly personalized and highly serendipitous. It's not like curing cancer, where there's something that we can do that would clearly benefit everyone. What kind of shape this would take is going to vary a lot on individuals. But to just give you like a broad indication, I think thinking about ways in which AI can improve people's relations with each other is one really valuable line to explore. So I think it was the CEO of Bumble a few years ago was talking about how she thought that the future of online dating would consist of my AI talking to your AI and figuring out, who's compatible and who's not, and thereby skipping out a lot of the kind of unpleasant friction in online dating. I know people like friction these days. It's a term that sort of people are saying, oh, friction's good. But online dating has a lot of the negative kind of friction as well. So removing that from the picture. Thinking about AI, ways in which AI could strengthen communities by helping put people in touch with, getting to know their friends and neighbors better, getting more involved in positive community projects. These are the kinds of flavor of example where I could see AI making a positive difference at that sort of this really rich textured level of human experience, rather than just the kind of grand technological schemes.
Maybe since you mentioned like personalization, that AI has context of like family and family dynamic, and can in a positive way like facilitate better communication between partners, and maybe between like parents and like kids, especially if like teenagers, they're like hard to deal with, right? Like maybe AI might be like some kind of this glue that builds that bondness.
That's a great term for it, right? Finding a way AI can sort of glue people together, or strengthen people's interpersonal bonds rather than sort of dissolving them. I think more like a glue than a solvent. I think that would be a really valuable line to explore. I mean, one other controversial angle here that I'm still have real mixed feelings about is how AIs could help parents with child rearing. So I think on the one hand, as soon as you say AI nanny, a lot of people's mind immediately goes to very, very dystopian scenarios, where two parents are glued to a screen and their two kids are interacting with an AI nanny rather than the parent. And I think there are legitimate, like real worries there about alienation and how AI could push people further apart. Finding ways that AIs can help parents relate to kids in the ways that sort of you mentioned. And I think it's even conceivable, or at least not beyond the bounds of possibility, that sort of some aspects of AI nannies could actually be positive. So I think right now, a lot of parents at some point, as I said, I've got young kids, and at some point the TV always comes out. The people have been talking about the third parent for years, for decades, the idea that the TV occupies this parenting role. And I think if we're talking about AI as a parenting aid, not replacing human time, but maybe offering sort of more dynamic experiences. If it's replacing, Peppa Pig, or replacing Coco Melon, or replacing relatively mindless TV activities for something more social, like helping two siblings organize games together, and playing again this kind of pro-social role. I think that would be one possible positive way in which the technology could be used in this kind of more cozy vision of an AI future.
I don't know if you've seen recently there was a Reddit post that 9-year-old girl was chatting with, I think it was Gemini, and asking swimming advice and sharing about her relationship with her siblings. And her mom saw that she talks to AI, and she was mad. She said that it's environmentally bad to talk to AI. I don't remember all the details, but basically mother prohibited her 9-year-old daughter to interact with AI. And that raises the question, what is the parenting should look like in the era of AI? Like, to me, I don't see like what is bad if you ask swimming advice from AI, right? Or share something, but different mothers have different perspectives. So it's really hard to, say here.
Yeah, I did see that post, and I think, like, on the one hand, I empathize with parents out there trying to figure out how to raise their children in this crazy, rapidly changing world. I don't want to speak too harshly, but it did seem like there was an element of shaming, which I think is always something that is you approach as very, very carefully as a parent, right? Before the idea that, oh, you're killing the planet with this stuff. When, I mean, honestly, like a 9-year-old using Gemini for a few prompts is not going to have a significant impact, right? If she was building a data center in her backyard, then maybe we can have a conversation about that. But that's not what this was about. But yeah, I think this is actually one area where I think tech could be doing a lot more is providing proactive guidance to parents, and not sort of making falsely confident claims, because as I say, like there's a huge amount we just don't know about, the impact of, for example, AI usage in early years. I mean, we're still having debates about the impact of screen time. Like smart devices have been around for 2 decades. So, we don't, in some extent, we don't know, but I think having that sort of open conversation between developers of these models and parents, as well as educators, I think building those better channels of communication is going to be a big part of what makes for will help us get this right. Help us ensure that technology has positive pro-social impacts.
I can relate to some concerns of parents. Let's say if a child just like shares a lot with AI, and you as a parent, you want your child to share with you, right? They're like concerns, what they're going through, what's happening in their lives, so you can help them. But if they share with AI and not sharing with you, and like you're like completely clueless what's going on, that's also, for a parent, it could be like really devastating. And like also like sharing maybe some like really personal, like intimate things about family. It's basically developers have access to that data. AI models being trained on that data. So basically all your family secrets out there, and that data is being used to train AI models. I don't know. Again, as a parent, do you want that? I don't know.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
there are lots of tricky things here.
That's a great example of an area where I think, something that I would also worry about as a parent. To mention maybe one positive use case, another one that I've sort of talked about before, and it just occurs to me. So I think one issue that a lot of parents, particularly of teenagers, struggle with is balancing protecting their kids versus respecting the privacy. Obviously, as kids enter their adolescence, it becomes more important to allow them that kind of privacy. Again, different parents have different rules on this. Some parents inspect all their kids' browser history. Others, say, do whatever you want. But I have sort of wondered here about a very specific application of AI, which would be as a sort of safeguarding intermediary, where, you could have like in my day, there used to be something called Net Nanny. I've no idea if it still exists, that would, block certain websites. But a more sophisticated AI-powered version of that would basically sort of be able to say, without requiring parents to surveil their children's activities, browsing activities super closely, say like, is there anything I should be worried about as a parent? Is my child going off in any kind of weird internet rabbit holes that could be a cause for concern? That would sort of find a nice middle ground between allowing children privacy, allowing particularly, adolescent children, as I say, privacy and scope and autonomy to explore their interests, whilst also doing some safeguarding. So that would be just like another simple example of maybe where there could be a genuine technological solution here to a problem that parents have faced for a while.